Welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood-Coleman, the Editor-in-Chief and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured country is Iran. This year, 2021, Iran indicated that it would return to negotiations aimed at reviving the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known colloquially as the Iran nuclear deal. Signatories to the 2015 JCPOA were Iran and the P5+1 countries, the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany. In 2015, it had been the Obama administration in the United States who had negotiated the agreement on behalf of Washington to place curbs on Iran's nuclear program and to ensure that Iran would not develop a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration that followed withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2018. According to President Trump, at the time, the JCPOA would not prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, even though actually at that time Iran had complied with the provisions of the accord. The United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA essentially defanged the power of the remaining signatories, destabilizing the accord itself and prompting Iran to take actions that breached the terms of the deal. In retaliation to Trump's actions, Iran violated the agreed-upon limit on uranium enrichment, resuming enrichment of uranium to 20%. The election of Joe Biden as United States President offered fresh hope to reviving the JCPOA, although President Biden and his foreign policy team signaled that their approach would be cautious. Indirect talks were held in Vienna, Austria, between Iran and the United States, starting from April 2021 through June 2021. The goal of the talks for the Biden administration was to curtail Iran's nuclear program, bringing them back into compliance with the JCPOA in exchange for the lifting of United States sanctions. The scenario took quite a different direction after the election of ultra-conservative Ebrahim Raisi as the new Iranian president. In fact, with the hardliner inaugurated into power in Iran, it was unclear if any kind of work on the JCPOA would even be viable. Another problem was that by October 2021, the director of the United Nations Nuclear Watchdog Agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, warned that the JCPOA was no longer intact. At issue was Iran's decision to deny camera access at a facility used to make centrifuge parts. But some optimism had also cleared on the diplomatic horizon in late October 2021. Following a meeting with the European Union's chief coordinator, Enrique Moro, Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, Ali Bagheri, announced that his country would return to the negotiating table. Talks to revive the Iran nuclear deal commenced in Vienna, Austria on November 29, 2021 at the Palais Coburg Hotel, where the 2015 JCPOA was initially concluded. Diplomats from Iran, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China were in attendance. The United States would be involved indirectly and warned that Iran's decision to ramp up uranium enrichment did not augur well for the talks. The head of the Iranian delegation, Bagheri, emphasized that lifting sanctions was the central priority for his country. That priority would not likely be in line with the priority of the United States, which would instead be focused on curbing Iran's nuclear development capabilities. Iran's moves to exceed the stated limits on nuclear activity, as set forth in the JCPOA, meant that the United States would be taking a highly cautious approach in these negotiations. In fact, Iran was not only enriching uranium to unprecedented levels, a scenario in isolation that would be regarded as concerning. In addition, its restrictions on inspectors from the IAEA would only add to the United States' skepticism. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi made clear that no progress had been made on the issues he raised during a visit to Tehran in late November 2021. This lack of accommodation and transparency from Iran was not going to go very far in rebuilding trust between the participants at the JCPOA revival talks. And yet, despite this lack of accommodation and transparency regarding nuclear development monitoring, Iran had advanced two proposals before the P4+1 countries, that is, the United States excluded. The body of the proposals did not seem consistent with previous negotiations, thus dismaying the European diplomats participating in the direct talks, as well as the United States, which was participating indirectly. Indeed, these two proposals would prove to be audacious and not in line with what had been painstakingly negotiated in the previous rounds of talks. Looking at the landscape, it would seem that Iran believed that the United States was intent on restoring the JCPOA. Indeed, it appeared that Iran assumed that the United States would be so eager to revive the JCPOA that it could force Washington to make concessions in order to appeal to Tehran. That expectation was not to be realized. At the start of December 2021, the United States ended its participation in the nuclear negotiations with Iran. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken declared that Iran was not generally committed to doing what was necessary to revive the nuclear deal and warned that his country had other options. Secretary of State Blinken said that the latest round of nuclear talks between Iran and the world powers had been terminated because Iran did not demonstrate the posture of a country serious about returning to compliance with the 2015 JCPOA. He also noted that the United States would not allow Iran to prolong diplomatic talks, essentially diplomatic talks, essentially so slow-walking the negotiations process while it accelerated its nuclear development program. To this end, Blinken observed that Iran's decision in recent months to enrich uranium to 60% purity and produce advanced centrifuges were profoundly dangerous. He added, "If the path to return to compliance with the agreement turns out to be a dead end, we will pursue other options." 90% purity would be required for weapons-grade uranium. While 60% was not yet 90%, it was an intensification of enrichment which had stood at 20% purity only months earlier. This decision by Iran was not just provocative, not merely defiant, but in fact alarming. Moreover, as Secretary of State Blinken noted, it meant that the time horizon and capacity available for Iran to return to JCPOA compliance was limited. The United States top diplomat observed that the JCPOA talks were not without its merits, as it allowed the United States to mend its ties with its closest allies. He declared, "We are now back on the same page with our closest allies and partners." To be sure, European diplomats from the United Kingdom, France, Germany appeared to be in sync with the United States as regards Iran's proposals. As reported by Agence France-Presse, the diplomatic representatives from these countries expressed disappointment and concern after carefully analyzing Iranian proposed changes to the text negotiated during these previous 6 rounds. Moving on to Ukraine. With Russia building up its military forces on the border with Ukraine in November of 2021, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called on Moscow to be more transparent regarding its military activities in proximity to Ukraine. When asked if he was concerned about a possible invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Stoltenberg stated that he believed it was imperative that NATO be clear-eyed and realistic about the challenges it faced. Anxieties were high given Russia's record of aggression towards Ukraine and its disrespect to Ukrainian sovereignty and territory, as exemplified by the 2014 annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, as well as the support for the separatist aspirations of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. For his part, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that if Russia moved its troops across the border, his country would be ready. He said, "There's a threat today that there will be war tomorrow." It should be noted that the actual nature of Russia's intentions remained unknown. However, Ukraine's Chief of Defense Intelligence, Kirill Budanov, explained that Russia had around 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. Budanov intimated that his country expected an offensive by Russia in January or February of 2022. Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Rezanov echoed these details in remarks before Parliament when he said the most likely time to reach readiness for escalation will be the end of January. He noted that a winter training period had already begun in Russia and some exercises were taking place near Ukrainian territory. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned that his country had evidence of a Russian plan for a large-scale attack on Ukraine. Blinken, however, noted that the plan did not mean that Russian President Vladimir Putin had made a final decision to invade Ukraine. Given the intensifying of tensions on the Ukrainian and Russian border, United States President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin took part in a video conference call. The White House said that the president voiced concerns of the United States and European allies about Russia's escalation of forces surrounding Ukraine, and made clear that the United States and allies would respond with strong economic and other measures in the event of a military escalation. President Biden also stressed support for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and called for de-escalation and a return to diplomacy. For Russia, the objective is to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. That was Moscow's red line, as it were. But the United States and its NATO allies have emphasized that Russia would not have a veto over Ukraine's desire to be part of NATO. Meanwhile, NATO leader Stoltenberg made clear that there would be consequences if Russia launched a military assault on Ukraine. Finally, I want to look at the second round of the presidential elections in Chile. The first round of the Chilean presidential election took place on November 21st, 2021. With no one candidate securing an absolute majority in that round of voting, a runoff election would be held quite likely in December 2021. The conventional wisdom has been that the main contest would have been between the conservative and center-left candidates, Sebastián Sichel and Jasna Provoste. Sichel, something of a moderate conservative, had been touted to be the most electable candidate and viewed as an early favourite in the race. But the conventional wisdom was completely upended when the two candidates emerging as the two top vote-getters in the first round were a far right-wing candidate and a progressive populist left-wing candidate. On the one hand was José Antonio Kast, a far-right candidate of the authoritarian Christian Social Front. Kast's brother had been a stalwart of Augusto Pinochet, and he was expressly campaigning on his defense of the regime of the former Chilean dictator. On the other hand was Gabriel Boric, a student activist leader representing the left-wing bloc Aprobó Dignidad. Boric rose to prominence as a protest leader arguing for higher quality education and was elected to Congress in 2014. Kast and Boric would be headed into the second round of the elections, offering the voters of Chile a sharp contrast in choices. The election had already been a polarizing one, and this runoff promised to further agitate deep social and political tensions in Chile. It was unclear how the voting would transpire in the second round. To whom would the supporters of the candidates who did not make it into the runoff migrate? Would the election be a matter of a polarized right versus left electorate? There was some suggestion that this was exactly the likely landscape Chileans should expect. The other conservative, Sichel, indicated that he would not vote for the candidate of the left, an apparent reference to Boric. The centre-left Provoste urged her supporters not to be neutral in the face of the fascist spirit that Kast represents. Polling data in the immediate aftermath of the first round indicated that the far-right pro-Pinochet candidate Kast was slightly ahead of the progressive leftist Boric. But within 2 weeks to go until the runoff, the landscape had changed and Boric was picking up the majority of supporters from most of the other candidates who contested the first round, with the exception of Sichel. In plain terms, both Boric and Kast were going into the runoff holding just over 25% support, respectively. Kast would benefit from inheriting the lion's share of Sichel voters showing up at the polls for the second round, but Kast would garner significant shares of the first round Provost, Umanami, Artes, and Parisi votos. Accordingly to CADAM, the only pollster that released consistent survey data in the month between the two rounds of elections, Boric was projected to carry a combined vote total of 45%, while Kast would carry about 40%. Meanwhile, about 15% of the electorate remained undecided. The reality was that there was a significant number of undecideds left to choose their candidate. Given the breakdown in the early December 2021 period, Kast would need those undecideds to break strongly for him in the runoff to win the Chilean presidential election. Boric would need about a third of the undecideds to break for him in order to clinch the presidency. Should Kast manage to win the presidency in the second round, he would have a tough road ahead in advancing his agenda, as his bloc won only 15 seats in the lower house. Boric would have an easier time since his party and other left-leaning parties were likely to be more in sync on the governing and legislating agenda. Other countries I'm covering and will continue to update in the next couple of weeks. The government in Austria, where the ruling party has named a new chancellor following a graft scandal. Germany's traffic light coalition talks being close to completion, and Olaf Scholz succeeding Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany. Also on my agenda, the landscape in the Horn of Africa, specifically with regard to Sudan and the coup d'etat and the ongoing state of emergency in Ethiopia. I'm also looking closely at the sentencing of ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been sentenced to jail for 2 years in Burma, also known as Myanmar, with more politically motivated trials to come. The end game for the military junta is to keep her jailed. I'd like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunsets in the Graveyard of Empires, which will be available for purchase from the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. Thank you for your time, have a great day, and remember now, more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.